I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today, which is the Darawal people. I just had to refresh my memory of those people. I'm in the Shoalhaven area at the moment, not in my usual location, so I just had to remember that. I actually was at an event recently that talked about the region, and we had a beautiful welcome to country from a local elder in the area, in the Austin Mere region. And they were talking about some amazing programs where they were bringing together First Nations people to actually co-design some family violence and children's early intervention programs. And I was really amazed to hear about that type of program. One of the things they were doing in this region was engaging men in those conversations around domestic violence, and engaging the First Nations men and having yarning circles that looked at how they could impact change in terms of family violence. So that was really fantastic, and that was from a Darawal elder. I would now like to introduce Graeme Innes, who was the former Disability Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. He played that role for 3.5 years and was also the Race Discrimination Commissioner for 2 years. Graeme is also a lawyer, a mediator and a company director, and is a mentor to many people, much like myself. I was fortunate to see Graeme post on LinkedIn about 18 months ago, I think it was, to say that he was willing to offer mentoring sessions to people, to give up 30 minutes of his time. And being a lawyer myself, I'd followed a lot of the work that Graeme had done at the Human Rights Commission and was really quite a big fan of you, Graeme. So I reached out and asked for one of those mentoring sessions. And I really posed a question to Graeme around coming into the space of disability, as Leor was going to do because we were about to become an NDIS provider. What did I need to know coming into the space as somebody who didn't have the lived experience? Because for me, it was really important to understand that I was going, or that Leor was going to be supporting people that had been through an experience that I hadn't been through myself. And so Graeme gave me a lot of contacts, a lot of stakeholders to contact, really directed me in terms of how to inform myself appropriately. And I'm really happy to say, Graeme, that I have made some really great contacts at some of those disability advocacy networks. And as a result, we've actually got one of their CEOs coming up in this series to talk a little bit about advocacy and how families can improve advocacy to achieve outcomes. And then we've also got Kareen Strauss, who's the CEO of a disability network that's currently engaging with the Australian Institute of Company Directors to engage more people with disability into mentoring roles in the disability and directorship governance space. So thank you for that guidance. It really set me off in the right path that hopefully is one that's continuing as part of my learning journey. Now, thank you for joining us today. Our audience here today is predominantly people working in the early childhood space, and part of this series is to inform and create thought-provoking discussion around how we can create more inclusive spaces for children with disability and create inclusive transition opportunities for children working between different services and also transitioning into primary school. So can you tell us from your experience how people working with children with disability could make the spaces more accessible to them?
Well, firstly, can I acknowledge that I'm on Bundjalung land in Tweed Heads, and the Bundjalung people up here in Tweed Heads, and just recognise the impact that floods and events have had, particularly on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians in this region, and how important it is that we as a nation take that into account. Thank you for the fantastic introduction. I should get you to write something for my website, or it's in such glowing terms. So thank you very much. You're very generous with your words. I did actually do, as you said, running a little series called Journey Time, because a lot of us in the last couple of years were not traveling in the way that we used to. And so I discovered I had a lot more time, and I wanted to put that into other people's journeys. And so that's how I framed it on my social media and my websites. Inclusion is really up to all of us, whether it's inclusion of adults or children. As I said, earlier when we were preparing, you know, I'm not an expert in early childhood education, but what I am an expert in, both from my own lived experience and my conversations with probably thousands of other people with disabilities throughout Australia during my working career, is the importance of inclusion and the way that we make all spaces for adults or for children inclusive is to do a couple of things in our minds. Firstly, we have to, because we make assumptions about people with disabilities or kids with disabilities, and those assumptions are usually negative and they're usually wrong. And we all do this. So we just have to recognize that that's what we do. We have internal bias, and we need to consciously change that. So what we need to do is lift what I describe as that low bar of soft expectations. Of low expectations. I describe it as the soft bigotry of low expectations. And it is a bigotry, and I call it out, and I have been doing that for a long time, because we assume that kids or that people with disabilities won't be able to do what other kids or adults do. And as a result of that, we limit our expectations of them. And by doing that, we indicate to them that they are excluded. And we do things which indicate that we are excluded. And what we have to do is not put those limits in place, but rather think about what kids with disabilities can, will, and want to do, and facilitate that by making adjustments to which we, as people with disabilities, are entitled. You know, and by adjustments, I mean that we provide an accessible entrance to a building, as well as the stairs that might be there. We provide material to me in alternate formats, as well as in print. We don't assume when we're making a presentation that everyone can hear us, or yell loudly at the top of our voice, "Is there anyone who can't hear me? Please put up your hand." Because of course, anyone who can't hear you won't put up their hand. And even if people can just hear you, they're probably not going to embarrass themselves by putting up their hand. You need to make the adjustment by, utilizing a microphone and a speaker system. So those are all things that are called reasonable adjustments. And we need to make those for people with disabilities. And you will find that by doing that, you get a stronger, a more diverse, a more interesting, and a more effective group of young children, because you're including everyone in the group. If you think about Afghanistan, and I'll stop in a minute, but I'll just make this last point. If you think about Afghanistan, one of the things that the Taliban are doing over there is preventing girls from going to school. Now, if we suggested that in Australia, people would quite rightly be appalled and outraged. Yet it's what we do by default to many kids with disabilities. We exclude them from our schools. We exclude them from our early childhood settings, and we give them an experience which is limited and where they don't have the opportunity to mix with their cohort in broader society. And that's what we need to change.
Thank you so much for that. That was just really captured exactly what we're trying to do as part of this program. Now, two things I want to lead on from what you just said, and I didn't want to embarrass you in the intro by saying this, but I'm going to do it now because you referred to it, which is sometimes we actually need to identify when people with disability are missing out on things. Now, Graeme, in his active state, when he wanted to make a point about New South Wales trains not including people with disability, made it really a point of bringing it to their attention that they were not actually calling out the next stop on the train line, and people with vision impairment wouldn't necessarily know that they were about to come to that stop. So how often was it that you wrote to New South Wales Trains to get that change made?
Oh, I lodged about 50 odd complaints. Every time I went on a train where there was no announcement, I lodged a complaint. And the way for you to think about that is to think how it would be if you were on a train and all the station signs and the signs inside the trains as to where you were taken away.
Exactly.
Just think what your train experience would be like, because that's what it was for me. And I spoke to the minister about this first, the relevant transport minister at the time, and I said to her, look, there's a standard which applies here. There's actually a regulation which applies, and Sydney trains are not complying with it. So I'm going to give you 12 months to fix this problem. And after that, every time I get on a train where there's no announcement, I will lodge a discrimination complaint, which I did. And about 40 of those eventually went to court.
Yeah, I mean, that's advocacy in action, right? And that systems change, but it's really frustrating that that's actually what you had to do. But that brings us to sort of our experience. So at Leor, we support children in the home and we deliver NDIS support. But a lot of those children are actually excluded from mainstream services. And it's not, the service's fault. It's not because people don't have the best intentions, but it's because the systems around those children are not set up to incorporate them and include them. So as part of this series, we're trying to just raise that from that perspective of the fact that we're seeing the exclusion in action, and we want to flip that and create inclusive environments for children. On that note, what sort of things do you think could be done to improve outcomes for these children, specifically looking at the NDIS and the way that organisations interact with the NDIS and how they could create better outcomes for children?
Well, the NDIS has in fact created thousands of better outcomes for kids with disabilities than there were before the NDIS, and it's important to start from that perspective. And I know there are problems with the NDIS. I'm very much engaged in that process of advocating for the NDIS and trying to make it less bureaucratic, less problematic, and not to have the funds restricted in the ways that they currently are being. However, having said that, the NDIS has hugely improved the outcomes for many, many Australians with disabilities, including kids with disabilities. What more might they do? Well, I think, again, they and the organisations involved in providing early childhood learning across the country should be better equipped to include kids with disabilities. Kids or people with disabilities want to be included in society. It's only society in general that is restricting us, making assumptions that we won't be able to be included and sending us to segregated or special education facilities or schools. But if society were not of that mindset, then we wouldn't need to spend all the money that we do on these special organisations, these segregated organisations for kids with disabilities. And I understand why some parents make a decision to send their kids to segregated settings. All of us who've been parents, our primary aim is to make sure that that our child is safe and protected from harm. And so, of course, when we see the way that kids with disabilities are treated in the outside environment, in the generalist setting, and we see that that setting doesn't adapt to kids with disabilities in the same way that it adapts to kids without disabilities, we as parents want to put our kids in a place that is safe and that keeps them protected from that. However, what we are doing by putting a child in a segregated early learning setting is setting that child on the path for segregation for the rest of their life. The Chief Executive Officer of Inclusion Australia calls it the polished pathway. And the pathway from segregated early learning settings guides kids with disabilities into segregated schools. That's the easier place for them to get into, because in the general schools are not keen to support them, keen to make that difference, keen to include, and so their they're guided towards segregated schools. And those segregated schools guide the kids towards segregated workplaces, sheltered workshops. And so people with disabilities stay in this pathway of segregation. And they're also guided towards group homes, which again are segregated settings. So we have what Catherine calls a polished pathway to keep people with disabilities segregated. All of us in society have an obligation to change that pathway and to ensure that kids with disabilities are welcomed and included in general settings in the same way that every other child is. And parents need to be supported by your organisations and by the NDIS to support their kids in included settings. Because, you know, these segregated settings, and this is not just my view, this is clearly researched, are inherently unsafe. They are less safe for kids with disabilities than general settings. And that's been demonstrated again and again and again with examples of people with disabilities who've experienced violence and abuse in segregated settings. And we're seeing examples of it in the Disability Royal Commission even today.
Yeah, it's been a part of my learning journey, as I mentioned at the start, because now I'm looking at things with that sort of lens because of the children that we support. So it's a case of, you know, once you've got that exposure, looking at where the barriers are. And one example that came to mind is I was fortunate enough to go on a little overseas holiday over Christmas, and I had to go and get my children's passports. And when I went to the passport office, I had to go once, and then I had to wait for an hour and a half in the queue. And then I get told that they just prioritized it. Then my husband had to go back 2 days later to pick up the passports. And I thought, how do people with unstable work do that? How do people in regional areas do that? How does a person with disability have the luxury to be able to do that? You know, what if they had to go overseas for an emergency to see their family? You know, there's just these systems in place that exclude people who are not in our purview, you know, in the mainstream view of life. And I think that that's, like you say, it's this pathway that we put other people on these other pathways as opposed to being included in what opportunities and systems are available for everybody else.
I mean, all of our systems do it. Our buildings do it to a lesser extent now because there are standards in place which force them when they're renovated or when they're first built to be accessible. Our transport systems did it and kept doing it even when there were standards to require the announcements to be made. And they weren't being made, so the standards weren't being complied with. And still many of our trains and trams are not accessible 20 years after those standards have come into place. But mostly it's done by people's negative and limiting attitudes, which I described at the beginning of this Zoom call. Yeah.
Coming back to your experience as the Disability Discrimination Commissioner, can you tell us one of the most significant impacts you had in terms of policy that you still see enforced today?
Well, I think I've just mentioned a couple. I was significantly involved with both the building standards and the transport standards. I was also involved with getting more and more captions on television, which are a great benefit to people and kids who are deaf, but they're also a huge benefit to many, many other people. And this is often the case with accessibility provisions. Because captions are really helpful for people whose first language is not English, or people who are in a noisy environment like a kitchen around dinner time in a family home where there's kids yelling and stuff going on. And if you switch on the captions, you can often turn down the sound on the television and just use the caption. So most accessibility benefits benefit other people as well. I can't tell you the number of people that have told me since I lodged my complaints against Sydney Trains, how much easier their journey is now because they're reading their book or looking at their phone, and they just listen out for the announcements and know when they have to get off, so they're not watching all the time. The audible traffic signals, people can do the same thing and then cross the road when the sound tells you. So there are almost every accessibility benefits more than just the people with disabilities that it's targeting. And that's another really good reason for inclusion of people with disabilities.
And we're going to come to questions in a minute. So this is my last question to Graeme before I open it up to everyone. So just have your questions ready. Just a practical tip that you could offer leaders. So people in their roles, I believe leaders act every day. You don't have to be given a leadership role to show leadership. How could they improve outcomes for people just in their everyday in terms of what they're doing?
It sounds basic and easy, but by just doing it, if someone is employing people, say those really powerful words to a person with a disability tomorrow or next week, you start on Monday. Or if someone is allocating resources, think about an early learning facility, think about its physical accessibility. Think about whether there's a quiet space for kids who may need it. Think about whether the material is available online as well as in print. Think about, this is a classic one for you guys, think about those communication books that you send home every day where the parents write to you about the kids and you write back to them about the kids. They are a fantastic idea. But throughout my daughter's early childhood and schooling, I didn't have access to those books. And I asked again and again if the centre could just put it on a computer so that I could get an email each day or look at a blog or whatever. I was prepared to do anything to know about my daughter's educational development. And it never occurred right through to the time that she got to year 12. And so the only way I had access to that information, I had two ways. One was to ask the teachers, which of course took up more of their time that they didn't have. And the second was to ask my wife to read it to her. Both of us have busy careers and I really work hard not to, she's my partner, not my reader. So I really work hard not to ask her to do that stuff, but it was the only option that I had until my daughter was old enough to read, and then she'd read it to me herself. So that sort of addressed the problem. But so just simple, basic stuff like that.
Thanks. That's a really good example. Any questions from the audience? You can pop them in the chat or you can take yourself off mute. And I think, look, that's given me food for thought, definitely, in terms of the way that we communicate with our families and how we can make those more accessible. Does anybody want to jump in with a question or some sentiments that you're experiencing after hearing, or how you might apply some of what Graeme said into your own practice?
I think we're doing quite, oh, okay.
A couple of people jump in at the same time. Jackie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, no, I was just saying we do quite a bit of that now with it being, we have it all on an app. We communicate with the families and they can kind of, it's a real time, so they can communicate and like as they go to sleep, as they have their nappy changes, what they've eaten, that's all updated, as well as like sending photos and updates on what they learn for the day. So we do a lot of, trying to get the parents to feel like they're on that journey with the children at the centre.
That's fantastic, Jackie. Is that app accessible for someone using a screen reader?
I'm not 100%, but that's something that we could actually look into. It's Explore. It's one that you can download from the App Store and all that. So.
Oh yeah, but that doesn't mean that's accessible. Unfortunately, okay. I wish it did, Jackie.
Yeah, no, that would be something that I'd have to look into and see if that's.
Well, there's lots of access experts, as well as your parents who have print disabilities, who would be able to tell you. But it's great. An app is a fantastic way to do it. And it makes sense these days when we're always on our phones to use an app. But it is important that that app is accessible.
Yeah, and it's actually a good point from a leadership perspective to think when we're choosing providers, do we run them through these types of questions when we're going through it? And Lee, did you have a question? there was somebody else who's going to jump
There
in.
was Erin just sent something in the chat, which I can quickly answer, which is, well, if you Google accessibility or accessibility experts, there's a whole stack of them, Intopia, Vision Australia, and a whole raft of others. So if you Google accessibility or training on accessibility, and you're right, as part of your procurement, you should be asking all of your providers if their programs, their facilities, their equipment, for instance, their play equipment is accessible.
Yeah, great. Bethany?
Yes, sorry, I was just going to say, I love how you said how inclusion benefits everybody. And I always say that to educators and families at Leor, that inclusion is the best practice for all children, not just children with complex needs. Yeah,
kids without disabilities really learn a lot from kids with disabilities. They learn different strategies that kids with disabilities have worked out to address issues that they may have. We are, when I say we, I mean the 20% of us that are people with disabilities. We are significant contributors to society, and we would be more if we weren't blocked from doing so.
And you find that particularly with siblings, with children with disability or children with medical needs, you find those siblings have huge amounts of empathy and resilience. And, they can really see when their sibling is being excluded and wants to make a way for them.
Yep.
Any last questions? No? All right. Well, I think you've taught me so much just in this short half hour, Graeme, and I'm hoping that others took away some really good practical tips that they can implement. I know at Leor we'll definitely consider that in terms of procurement, in terms of training, how we can improve outcomes for more than just the children that we're seeing. And again, I hope for those of you that do, are involved in advocacy or raising voices of children, families, or even your team, that Graeme's outcomes in terms of Sydney Trades gives you some motivation that there is systems change and advocacy that can work and make a change for a huge amount of people and create positive impacts that have a ripple and longer lasting impact. Thank you again.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us.
And if you do put it on your website, the recording on your website, please let me know and I'll push it out on my social media.
Absolutely. We'll definitely do that. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.